I'm Duncan McLeod, and this is TC Daily, the technology show brought to you by TechCentral. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so at youtube.com/TechCentral. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to our daily newsletter? That's techcentral.co.za/newsletter, and you'll receive that every morning at 5 a.m. in your inbox. Now, very pleased to welcome on the show today Russell Southwood. Russell, I certainly think, Russell, it would be fair to call you a veteran of
many years
telecoms and ICT
Yeah.
on the African continent. You probably know more about the development of telecoms on this continent than just about anybody else. So it's really great to have you in the studio, and thank you so much for making the time.
Pleasure to be here.
Russell, the reason we're talking to you today is that you have a book out.
I do indeed.
Which I haven't finished reading yet, but is very, very interesting so far, and certainly intend finishing reading it. The book is called Africa 2.0, Inside a Continent's Communications Revolution. And this really goes back over the last 30, 35 years, looking back at how communications in Africa has developed, and it has changed completely, right? When you started in this field, which was when exactly?
2000.
Around 2000,
So
okay.
out of that 35-year space, 20 I've actually been here for. And the prehistory is in those previous 15 years.
Now, many in the industry know you for your Balancing Act weekly newsletter, which is very well read and digested, which you've been running for more than 2 decades now. How did you get into the space? And you're originally from the UK. Where did your interest in Africa come from?
I was from the UK, and I read an article in Wired magazine by John Perry Barlow, who set up the Electronic Frontiers Foundation.
Probably in one of these here somewhere,
Indeed,
actually.
Indeed. And he came to Africa to look at the internet. And he was very Californian, and sort of, it seemed like 50% of it was kind of absolutely fascinating, and 50% was sort of, you know. And it got me interested. So I came down and I visited 4 countries. And before I went, everybody said, oh, there's nothing there, you know, kind of, I don't know why you're doing this. And there was networks, and there was people, you know, using phones and all the rest of it. And it could only get better. So I did a little newsletter, and out of that little newsletter, people started sending me stuff. A guy from Madagascar sent me 2,000 words on the state of the internet in Madagascar. And it sort of went from there. And it was a very small community in those days, whereas nowadays, you know, there are you know, literally, you know, tens and hundreds of people interested in this area. So, and that's a sign of success, I think, for the continent. And it's a pleasure to see that there are so many people, you know, are now interested in it.
So it was originally an article by John Perry Barlow that just sparked your fascination with the continent. What were you doing before this?
Before that, I was working in the UK as a management consultant in the sort of creative industries, arts area. And I just got kind of bored with doing the same thing over and over again. And I got to the point where I knew the answers to the questions before the questions had been asked. And that's very bad news, you know. So I wanted something that was going to challenge me. Fair to say, working in Africa is always a good challenge.
Now, I like in the introduction to your book, you talk about, and it is a figure, a quote that's been used quite a lot by industry leaders. And I think I remember Jay Naidu, who was one of the early communications ministers in South Africa. Could have been his predecessor, Palo Jordan, the first communications minister under the ANC, who said that there were more phone lines in Manhattan than in the entirety of Africa in the late 1980s. Boy, things have changed, haven't they?
They have. I tried to find the source for that, and I couldn't. So all I said at the beginning of the book is, you know, this was out there, you know, and now you have a situation in which large parts of the billion-plus people on the continent now have access to voice, and increasingly people have access to internet. But what is interesting is it has been a kind of long arc of change, because voice led on to mobile internet, led on to mobile money, led on to startups. So the road just kept getting wider and wider.
And it continues.
And it continues to get wider. And in a way, we're at the end of the beginning. We're not, you know, and when people look back, they will say, this is the point that the continent changed. You and I are both old enough to remember what the 1980s were like. And here in South Africa, there was still apartheid. And, you know, kind of much has changed since then. And in many ways, South Africa was one of the key places in terms of lighting the fuse for that particular change, because by granting the licenses for mobile operators. It may not have been done very well here, but what it did was international investors began to say, well, if we can go into South Africa, we can go to other places. And so both MTN and Vodacom spread out across the continent, and particularly MTN going to Nigeria, which was really a big thing. And if you look at the impact of what has happened in Nigeria with MTN, you know, when it started, it was a few hundred people, of which 80 were South Africans. Now there are 19,000 people, and I would be very surprised if there were that many expats there. And with that, it has brought skills, a completely different range of skills. And so the key investment areas are mining and oil and all that, number one, telecoms, number two. But telecoms brings with it skills that you don't get when you dig stuff out of the ground, because actually mining is largely digging stuff out of the ground in a much smaller level of management, if you will. Whereas actually, you know, the skills that are spread across the continent through the process of doing telecoms and internet, you know, that skill upskilling. You know, we complain about the levels of skills, but actually, if you think back, there were hardly any. There are now incredible numbers of people who have different skills, whether it's technical, like engineering and so on and so forth, or whether it's marketing, or whether, you know, on and on you go.
You spoke about the impact of private sector investment and Vodacom and MTN and their expansion across the continent, and there are other big players as well. But mobile actually started, and I think many people will be surprised by this, but mobile in Africa actually started in the then Zaire, which is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, under the dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko. How did that come about?
Well, it was a very strange thing. There was a Rwandan called Miko Ruatiri, and he joined up with a guy called Joe Gatt. And Joe Gatt, who is still alive, had been the station manager for one of the airlines. He had arranged various leasing deals for aircraft for Mobutu, and therefore was close to him. And Mobutu went to the States, so they arranged for these very big sort of half-brick mobile phones to be available to them in the States. And they got the go-ahead after a year, and they gave these phones to all the ministers, and the ministers never paid anything. So you had a kind of problem, because it was still the old Africa. They got a license, but actually the license didn't really protect them, because it was a kind of sort of nod and a wink, and you know, if they tried to cut people off, the soldiers would come around and tell them, and you know, one of their operations managers was very badly beaten up and left, and quite sort of lawless, really, and
kind of what you'd expect under Mobutu.
Absolutely. But that, in parallel, happened with Econet's Strive Masiwa, who was fighting his way through the courts against the Mugabe government in Zimbabwe, and he eventually got to the other side of that, and he got a license, and then the South African licenses followed after that, and that was just the beginning of the process. But actually, that alone, liberalisation alone, wouldn't have done it. In the early days, the mobile operators were innovators in a way that they probably have ceased to be as good at as they were then. And MTN did prepaid calling in Uganda, and what had been a really rather small market was just Celtel, suddenly started burgeoning, because actually this was the way that you could get people with very little money to be able to buy phone units. And before you knew it, there were people, I don't know if you remember, there used to be guys would stand on the side of the road with these sort of cards, SIM cards kind of arrayed down their front. And huge sums of money went directly to the street level. Now, of course, there are dealerships and so on and so forth, but it really made a change, because those guys had something to sell, and it was like Coca-Cola. It was a
prepaid changed the model and sparked this explosion of communication across the continent. A lot of people assume it was invented here in South Africa. A lot of South Africans, I think it was invented by either MTN or Vodacom or both around the same time and implemented here first. But you say it wasn't. It was implemented elsewhere in Africa first.
I think it was implemented by MTN here in South Africa and in Uganda.
And in Uganda.
In Uganda. So, that was the start of it. And other things happened. Like originally people were sold minutes, and then they were sold seconds. And then the cost of buying the SIM card came down to almost nothing, to a trivial sum. And so, and the thirst that there was for communications in Congo-Brazzaville, when Celtel opened its office there, the office was absolutely mobbed to such an extent that the police had to be called because so many people wanted a phone. And every business target that people set was broken, within months rather than within the years that they imagined it would take to get there.
Now, you must have traveled quite extensively in Africa as well. You must have met some really, really interesting people. In your 20, 25 years of running Balancing Act and talking to people, industry players, and traveling in the continent, what are some of the key moments that have really stood out for you?
It's funny, they're often quite trivial and quite sort of life-related. When I started, when you travel into a country, you get yourself a driver, basically, and the driver would always, you'd say, I want to go here, and the driver would ring a friend of his, and the friend would say, yeah, well, that's sort of down here. Or if you're in Ghana, they say it's the third on the left past the flower cellar. And then suddenly it was possible to get a modem and have Google on your iPad and be telling the driver, no, it's left here, and so on and so forth, because Google had mapped all this. And then I arrived in Kenya, and I can't remember which year it was probably 2012. And I said to the driver, I want to go here. And he said, oh, give me a moment, I'm going to look on Google Maps. And so suddenly you could see this process working its way through at quite a sort of seemingly trivial level, but actually made an enormous amount of difference in many ways.
And some of the people you've met over these years, anyone who's really stood out for you?
There's so many. It's difficult.
Do you prefer talking to startups or to the big telcos, or who really interests you?
I think it's the people who are trying to make changes. And in the early days, the mobile operators were very interesting. So people like Terry Rhodes and people like that from Celtel were very interesting because actually it was a new business, and there was a kind of energy, and they were always kind of moving just sort of one step ahead of where they should be. But over the years, you deal with mobile operators, and you talk to people about mobile operators now, and it's quite bureaucratic. There's quite a lot of process, and you can't do things quickly. So it's quite interesting, I suppose, kind of MTN has taken IOBA and set it up, which is its social platform, and set it up as a separate entity. Why have they done that? Because it's actually impossible, really, to get a decision out of a mobile operator,
They're big corporates.
They're big corporates, and they are the new incumbents. They are the guys who control. And increasingly, there is less and less competition in many markets. There's a consolidation going on. Several operators have left the continent, and this reduces the amount of competition. And so I think there's some very real issues there in terms of what happens in the future.
Yeah. Now, a lot of what we've seen in Africa has been driven by the private sector and private sector investment. In your view, and certainly in the South African context, there was probably a lot of resistance to the private sector being involved in the economy. We saw at one stage the Director General even trying to shut down the arrival of undersea cables to South African shores. Do you think the communications revolution that we've seen in Africa has happened in spite of governments and politicians? Or do you think they've come around and have actually helped build the ecosystem?
It's a mixed picture, but actually you would have to say that before the private sector got involved, you were in a situation where some of these state telcos had an 80-year waiting list to get a fixed line, and so you were then in a situation where you could go into a shop, 15, 20 minutes later, come out with a phone. So there is a complete difference. And the governments didn't have the investment, they didn't have the expertise, and that's what the private sector bought. And, very, very quickly it was able to invest in countries, even countries that were in civil war, places like Liberia, Sierra Leone, DRC, all those places, Somalia, actually almost build around civil conflict and get things going. And it made a huge difference. I mean, it's hard to remember the days before the mobile phone. You try and arrange to meet somebody in a bar, it was a bit of a random chance that you actually managed to meet them.
Yeah.
So, it made a big, big difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we've seen the impact of mobile and the private sector in mobile and creating this communications revolution in Africa. But in fixed lines, we left behind. Africa never really had a fixed line infrastructure, which is why there were more phone lines in Manhattan and on the entire continent. But even that seems to be changing now, Russell. in South Africa, there's a lot of fiber deployment happening. It's being driven by the private sector. We had the CEO of Vumatel in here a week or two back who said they're going to deploy fiber to shacks at less than 100 Rand a month for uncapped internet. Do you think that what we've seen in mobile is going to be replicated in fixed and in fixed broadband?
I think it will happen much more slowly. I think one of the points of the book is that it's perfectly possible to launch a technology every 3 months. But actually, to use the academic phrase, people need to appropriate a technology. Translation, it means it has to become part of their lives.
Yeah.
And that is a much longer process. And if you look at all the big changes that have occurred, they've all taken something like 5 to 10 years. And people tend to think, we roll it out and, huge take-up and all the rest of it. And these things were actually quite hard work, So when mobile money was launched outside of Kenya, you needed experiential marketing to explain to people how to use it. You could sign up lots of people, but they didn't end up using it. And so to explain what it was and to get them comfortable with using it is a much longer process. And that's true of what you're now talking about, which is fibre to the home. I think that the COVID-19 lockdowns in many African countries was like a test drill. You had to work from home, your kids had to be educated at home. I mean, if you had the money, then actually you then began to say to yourself, A, the internet is rather important, and B, we need to do certain things in order to get it. So you started using Zoom, Teams, on and on you go, and all of those things. And you began, in wanting to entertain yourself, to have a much better connection. So start getting fibre to the home for things like Netflix, for things like Amazon, for Showmax, all of those kinds of things, all of the things that are layered over the infrastructure.
I want to talk about some of the things that mobile has enabled in Africa. We spoke about how prepaid was sort of the catalyst for this explosion, but there were a whole lot of services that then got built on top of mobile that was rolled out. You spoke about Google Maps, for example, big social media companies, all those sort of services. But there are other things that people don't talk about that often, which you mentioned in your book. Radio. Suddenly you had this device in your pocket with an FM receiver in it. And you can't sell a cell phone on this continent if it doesn't have that FM receiver in it, because no one will buy it.
No, absolutely.
It must have had a big impact on broadcasting.
It did in two ways. I mean, one, there's somebody in the book who describes the mobile as the remote for the younger generation. And actually, you access music streaming, you access videos, Nollywood, all of those kinds of things. Suddenly you have this device. It may not have a great screen. I remember a Nollywood director saying to me, who would watch a Nollywood movie on it? Well, people do. They watch stuff on their phone because it's there. I think the other thing is actually that all of this stuff that is layered on top is actually what the point of having the phone was. Because actually SMS wasn't, yes, it was helpful to have it, but actually it's not terribly easy to convey very much in that short number of characters. So all of these services that go on top actually are something that people want. And the speed with which Uber took off in Kenya was kind of interesting, because it's quite an international, Nairobi in particular, quite an international city in some ways. And so and with the arrival of internet, you have not the first startups, because there was always stuff before. There was Mark Shuttleworth and there was Africa Online and stuff like that. But from about 2010 onwards, the internet was the beginning of the startup boom. And the startup boom really was about, we now have internet, so there are a series of things we can do. I think we need to step back, though, from that sort of wave of growth and emphasize that those that use internet in the main have education and income, or some combination of that. And actually, you still have quite large numbers of people who are illiterate, and they are either illiterate because they don't read or write, because the education levels aren't, education provision is not as good as it ought to be, or they're functionally illiterate, so they don't know how to, do certain kinds of things, or they're tech illiterate. And that means that you have a kind of large part of the market which currently isn't accessible. And then the other divide you have is that women are less likely than men to use the mobile internet. And that's things like the patriarchy and the way relations are structured between the genders. And so there's, again, a whole other range of people. Now, as we move forward and education increasingly gets better and those things are addressed, then hopefully the market will get larger and larger.
Yeah. And access to communication will help, because if you've got access to the internet, you've got access to education, et cetera,
Absolutely.
et cetera.
Absolutely. So it is both the solution and the bridge.
Russell, how significant was the development of mobile money? I mean, it's been something that was really mushroomed on the African continent specifically.
Yes.
In fact, it was invented, in effect, by Safaricom through Vodafone.
Yes.
Just give me an idea of the impact that that's had, because we don't probably feel
It's
it as
an
much
interesting story.
here in
I
South Africa.
do the story very, very quickly.
Yes.
Through a constellation of circumstances, DFID, which is the British Development Agency, put money into a pilot with Safaricom. And out of that pilot, which was originally intended for microcredit, they noticed in real time, as they watched people transacting on the platform, that actually they'd worked out that they could send each other money. So it wasn't the original idea for it. And actually what you've got is this, explosion. But it seems such an obvious thing. But there was a thing that was invented by Celtel called CellPay, which was very similar.
Yep.
The difficulty was that people didn't trust it. So they eventually had to sort of turn it into a kind of corporate money deliverer. And so you can see that it takes time for people to have the trust, to change their habits and so on and so forth. But what it's done is it meant that you can send money from one person to another. It's little understood, though, and it's quite paradoxical. It's a cash-in, cash-out system in the main. The majority of people still use cash. B, it's a cash-in, cash-out system. If I send money to somebody in the rural area, they can't use a digital currency because nobody there accepts it yet. So actually the next phase is moving to a situation where people will hold value on the wallet and so on and so forth. And there is now a whole ecosystem, both transferring money internationally, between countries. There are corridors like, the Burkinabe cocoa growers who go south to Ghana and to Cote d'Ivoire, and they send money back to Burkina Faso. And you can see that money route, as it were, and it explodes sideways. There's one to Lake Kampala, to Entebbe, and the fish comes out of the lake, it's sold, and you can see the money then goes to the petrol stations and so on. So you have these corridors. And so all of that is developing. And actually, it's very interesting. There's a quote in the book from Dario Cujo, who runs MFS Africa, who is one of the companies within this financial ecosystem. And he was saying that, if you think about the potential African customer used to be a woman with 2 types of firewood on her head by the side of the road, and nowadays it's that same woman will be in a city somewhere, will be watching football, will be using Facebook, and as that digital generation moves through, all sorts of magic will happen because they don't feel remotely uncomfortable. The presidents all have to be advised on how to use social media. I live long in the day that we may eventually have a president of an African country who is 40 or 50 rather than 60 to 80, who actually knows this stuff because she used it when they were young. Yeah.
Interesting. The president of Rwanda seems to be fairly tech savvy. What are your views on him?
Yeah. It's a strange country, and it's a small country, and he has managed to do all sorts of things quite interestingly with technology, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes. My slight hesitation is that his ability to assassinate his opponents always causes me some cause for concern.
Fair enough. Let's not delve too deeply into that one. Russell, you've travelled extensively on the continent.
Yeah.
Is there a particular market that you have an affinity for, and if so, why?
I think there's, in terms of the Anglophone countries, there's 2 countries I always come back to for slightly different reasons. One is Nigeria, because there's always fantastic energy there, and it's completely unpredictable as to where that energy will go. And the tragedy of it is you have such bright and talented people there, And the structures, the political structures, and sometimes the commercial structures mean that those people are not able to fulfill their full potential. So that's Nigeria. Kenya is really interesting, again, because it has this sort of mix of cultures in Nairobi, and it has managed to, in a sense, punch above its weight consistently. You know, it's taken and run with the phrase Silicon Savannah, which is a bit of an oversell, but actually it's a good shorthand. And it's always a pleasure to be there because somebody is always doing something interesting there. Francophone Africa is much harder because the culture is very different, and it has taken them a while to get, you know, startups going in quite the same way. It is now happening, and there's some quite impressive startups there. But yeah, I mean, you have to understand, I suppose, about Africa is, I don't have to tell you this, but you know, some of your listeners viewers may have to understand it. Is it many, many countries, and
Vastly different.
Vastly different, and you know, kind of one can be very, very different from the other.
Yeah. Now, you dedicate a section of your book to corruption.
Yes.
Why did you do that? How does corruption manifest in telecoms in Africa, and what are the implications of it?
I think a thread throughout the book is, yes, it's about technology, but it's about that thing I was speaking about earlier of how it beds into everyday life. And if you don't talk about corruption, then it's very, very hard to understand actually why certain things happen. And we are looking at what you might call patronage capitalism. So I was speaking to somebody a couple of days ago down at AfricaCom in Cape Town, who was saying, well, you know, in this particular country, unless you're a friend of the president, you don't do business. And that means that the private sector can't really operate as it should do. It means that the friends of the president are in place, earn the money from, are the local shareholders, and the net result of that is you don't get all the good things. So that's really why I wanted to cover it. The other thing too is that if you are a startup, and that's how the world works, it's quite difficult to then get into bigger business, as it were, because actually somebody is standing there saying, I should have a local shareholding in this. And I think startups are quite interesting because they provide the energy and the ability to provide some very small way of changing that kind of patronage capitalism. It's the sort of thing where the president, you know, makes sure that his friend gets the dealership for a particular car, and there's only one dealership in the country.
Right.
So breaking that down, and I think startups do that.
Is that a problem that's endemic across the continent? Are there some markets that are getting it right?
I think there's elements of it in all the countries, but some countries it's sort of easier to negotiate than others. You know, some are, Nigeria is just so big, it's hard to fix everything.
Yes.
But on the other hand, you know, there's always somebody looking to do so. Kenya, you know, the doors are easier to push open. Here, in all sorts of ways, you know, South Africans understandably are very critical of their country and, you know, how it's run and all the rest of it. But actually, there are opportunities here in a way that, you know, would go begging elsewhere.
Interesting.
So, you know, yeah, there are countries where it's less of a dead hand.
Let's look to the future.
Right.
And where we're going. There's a lot of investment happening. I'm amazed at how much money is flowing into data center infrastructure at the moment. Yeah. Especially here in South Africa, but also elsewhere on the continent.
$6 billion.
Astonishing.
Announced. Yeah. So
undersea cables as well.
Yeah.
Equiana. We've got To Africa cable coming sometime, I think, in 2024. Yeah. So there's a lot of money being spent on infrastructure. 5G is just starting to be rolled out in some African markets, including here in South Africa. Where's this going, Russell? I mean, this incredible investment that's happening must lead to something, but what is that something?
I was very struck, being in AfricaCom this week in Cape Town, about the way that people are reinventing themselves. They've been trying for the best part of 10 years, but they finally seem to have got to the point where they know if they don't do it, something bad will happen to them. So you have both MTN and Vodacom talking about going from being a telco to being a techco. It's you know, you use any words you like. You have people reinventing the buying and selling of connectivity. you used to be able to sell to enterprises very, very expensive bandwidth. By the time those two cables arrive, enterprise bandwidth will become a commodity. So you have people automating the process of buying bandwidth. I've bought, I've gone out and asked for quotes for bandwidth for clients at various points, and it was a gruesome process. It sometimes took 3 to 6 months to get a quote. And if you can automate that, there are people in the market who are doing that, and the data centers are like airports. You can send your data to that data center, and then it's on delivered there, and you can connect into the world. And if actually data becomes, much as it is in other parts of the world, something you don't fear. And I think prices have come down here again as a result of the, if you will, the COVID test drill. If you don't fear the cost of data, then you will do all sorts of things. And I think we're at the beginning of that moment. And it's very interesting. It will be very interesting to see what happens. The tough part is that actually all of the digital stuff is not high margin. So if you imagine you're going to get into digital and suddenly replace all your what were quite high margin voice revenues and SMS revenues and all of those things, you're not going to. So the thing that isn't a mobile operator, formerly called a mobile operator, I suspect will have many less people working for it. They will have a completely different skill set. But at the moment, quite narrow, maybe a quarter of the continent is actually using internet. That figure will get up to maybe 50% over 10, 20 years.
Russell, unfortunately, we are out of time, but we could continue this conversation all afternoon. So next time you're in Joburg, it's an open invitation. Please join us in the studio again, and let's have a longer conversation about some of these topics, because there's so much to dig into and explore. But before you go, if anyone's not subscribed yet to Balancing Act's newsletter, how do they go about doing that?
You go on to www.balancingact-africa.com and subscribe there.
And if anyone's looking for your book, Africa 2.0, Inside a Continent's Communications Revolution, it's available in paperback and hardcover, I believe.
And it's available in e-version on Amazon, which is one of the easiest ways
Kindle.
for South Africa, on Kindle. Or Take a Lot will sell you a hardback.
A hardback.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Great.
Well, I look forward to finishing the book. It's probably on my list. Well, it is on my list to read this December holiday.
Good.
Congratulations on the book, and look forward to welcoming you in the studio again at some point. Russell Southwood, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to TechCentral today.
Pleasure to talk to you.